Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk About the Middle East. I'm Andy Blanche.
And I'm Juliana Musheyev, and John Dickman is here today helping us with the show.
On this show, we talk about the Middle East, its culture, politics, religion, history, just about anything that captures the complexity of the region.
We hope to promote open and honest discussion about the conflict in Israel and Palestine and to humanize the conflict by getting to know people who have a stake in the issues. You're listening to WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton. The opinions and views expressed on Let's Talk About the Middle East are strictly those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the station manager, the board of directors, or anyone else affiliated with WSLR.
Attend the Rain Barrel Workshop, Saturday, March 19th, 10 to 11 a.m. at Twin Lakes Park, 6700 Clark Road in Sarasota. Learn how the use of rain barrels can conserve water, save money by reducing the use of potable water in landscapes, and reduce stormwater runoff by storing and diverting runoff from impervious surfaces. Practical tips on the construction and installation of rain barrels will be provided. After the class, rain barrels will be available for sale. To register for this free class, contact David Pusso, Environmental Specialist, at 941-232-8397. Today we'll be talking with Professor Frack Alcock from New College of Florida about foreign policy and the upcoming Democratic primary. Those who have followed the election may easily be able to describe the domestic policy differences between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. You hear the candidates repeat these distinctions at every debate. Bernie Sanders does not have a super PAC and does not take any money from Wall Street. He has spent his whole life fighting special interests in Congress and maintaining a laser-like focus on income inequality. Hillary Clinton touts her practical approach to domestic policy, often accusing Sanders of being too idealistic. She often refers to herself as a progressive who will get things done. What the public may not be clear on is the differences in the candidates' foreign policy. Clinton is often described as hawkish and is prone to quick intervention, while Sanders prefers diplomacy and believes in war as a last resort. People who have clear preferences for one mode of action over the other have probably made their decision about which candidate bears the best represents their interests. Juliana and I have our own position on this issue, which is not necessarily the one taken by our guest. The purpose of today's discussion is not to sway people towards one direction or the other, but to explore the point of view of someone who comes from an academic political science tradition as he responds to common concerns expressed by both sides.
As it gets closer to the Florida primary on March 15th, it's important to listen to information about the candidates' policies with a critical ear. We urge you to think not only about the positions you hear expressed, but also about what you yourself believe is important. Do you want a president who is quick to intervene, possibly leading to dangerous consequences, or a president who will defer intervention and possibly risk losing an opportunity to make a difference? Do you want a candidate who has experience working a system that exists, or a candidate who is determined to change that system and whose strategy rests on rewriting the rules? Every voter must make a decision about what they value and which candidate has the vision and goals that most closely match their own. And with that, we go to our interview. We're interviewing Professor of New College Frack Alcock. I also want to mention that the views expressed by Professor Alcock do not in any way reflect the views of New College of Florida. Frack Alcock is an associate professor of political science at New College of Florida, where he teaches courses on world politics, international law, and environmental policy. He appears regularly as a political analyst with ABC News in Sarasota, and he hosts a regular TV program on the Manatee Education Television channel. Let's play the interview. Go.
Thank you for joining us today, Professor Alcock.
Happy to be here.
Can you describe to us how the foreign policy positions of the two candidates differ?
To try to encapsulate it briefly, Hillary Clinton, I think, is more prone to intervention and application of U.S. power. She's an advocate of what, in my classes, we talk about as smart power, both a combination of more traditional military power as well as more persuasive diplomatic power. Bernie Sanders, I think, could be accurately characterized as less prone, less impulsive in terms of intervention, so I think it'd probably fare as non-interventionist. The other salient difference probably is we've heard a lot in the last couple of primaries on the trade issues, and so I think Hillary Clinton is more favorably disposed towards trade agreements, and Senator Sanders has been more resistant, hostile, I guess, at times on some of the trade agreements. So a lot of their differences flow from those. I think those are big, important ones that people should know.
Very important.
Hillary Clinton has largely depended on her experience as Secretary of State as a major selling point for her foreign policy acumen. During her tenure as Secretary of State, Clinton was instrumental in several political and military interventions against foreign nations. For example, she played an important role in supporting the military coup that ousted democratically elected President of Honduras, Manuel Zelaya, in 2009, the bombing and subsequent dismantling of Libya in 2011, and also beginning in 2011, the U.S.-backed civil war in Syria, which has claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Syrians. Given Clinton's legacy as Secretary of State, should her experience be seen as a selling point or a warning sign?
Well, it depends on who you ask. With respect to the warning, I think both characterizations, depending upon, as a voter, your predispositions could be accurate. So she's not going to, if you vote for Hillary Clinton, you're not going to get Noam Chomsky as your president. So in that sense, the interventionist impulses will be there for better or worse. There's certainly a case to be made, I think, for failure to intervene in a number of places, and the counterfactual not getting involved in a variety of different areas of the world where genocide is occurring sometimes, leads to even worse outcomes. And so there's something to be said for experience. There's something to be said for, I think, lessons learned, learning from your mistakes. Some candidates might be able to do that. Others, might not. But I think, and I would also point out, it's been a pretty tumultuous time worldwide over the Obama administration and in the years that she served as the Secretary of State and those thereafter. So we're looking at a lot of really problematic areas in the world where getting involved has led to bad outcomes, and not getting involved has led to bad outcomes. So it's a tough theater for her right now in terms of her decisions, in terms of where they've led.
Let me ask a follow-up question. You mentioned learning from your experience, which is one of the things we hope people do from their experience. Do you think Hillary Clinton has shown the ability to learn from her mistakes and revise her approach?
Yeah, I think that's one. I do. I think you see that not only on foreign policy. She's not going to turn into a non-interventionist, but she certainly learned on healthcare. And while she was not the architect of Obamacare, I think you see adaptation on the things that she was doing within the Bill Clinton administration. And then I think a telling sign, honestly, for her foreign policy, if you think back during when she was the First Lady, were the years under the Clinton administration where you had the Balkan Wars and the collapse of the former state of Yugoslavia. You had the Rwandan genocide, which has given rise to the movement, the responsibility to protect movement, worldwide. And then you had at the very tail end, you had a NATO intervention in Kosovo, which there's still criticism of that, but there's a case to be made that a lot a lot more people would have died had that not gone relatively well. And so I think coming back as the Secretary of State, you do see her when she's, in these situations where there's about to be mass slaughter and you have a dictator, her impulses, I think we can get in there and help. And that it doesn't always end well.
Yeah. So we don't know as much about Senator Sanders' foreign policy, but we do know that in 2002 he opposed the war in Iraq while Hillary Clinton supported it. When he spoke to Congress opposing the resolution, he warned about the devastation that the war would cause in Iraq and at home. What does it tell us that these two candidates had such differing views on a critical foreign policy issue?
I think it reflects their point of departure and their disposition. The outcomes of the Iraq War, the entire basis that was sold to the American public by the Bush administration were, imminent dangers posed by weapons of mass destruction. That turned out to be false, and the execution of the war went pretty badly. So the vote in favor of it does not look well for Hillary Clinton now. The question, I guess, I think Bernie Sanders, in terms of the predictions, it looks a little prescient in terms of what actually happened. Yeah. Had there actually been weapons of mass destruction, or had there been a tighter case, or had you not had an administration that was sort of selling some false goods to the American public, would Sanders have had the same, position? And I don't know, but I actually, I think his impulses towards non-intervention, I don't recall him saying at the time that I don't believe the case being made. I think, even if there are weapons of mass destruction, he doesn't, he thinks it's bad to intervene, and he thinks it'll go horribly wrong, and it'll destroy the country internally, and we're going to make a mess of Iraq. He was right on a number of those accounts. But what does it tell us about the two candidates? I think it's consistent with Hillary's. She senses danger. She wants to be proactive, and I think Bernie Sanders tends to be a little bit more resistant to entanglements and intervention.
Interesting.
So, according to the IB Times, under Clinton's leadership, the State Department approved $165 billion worth of commercial arms sales to 20 nations whose governments have given money to the Clinton Foundation. That figure derived from the 3 full fiscal years of Clinton's term as Secretary of State from October 2010 to September 2012, represented nearly double the value of American arms sales made to those countries and approved by the State Department during the same period of President George W. Bush's second term. Sanders has run his campaign largely on the fact that he is not beholden to any special interest. Do you think their different approaches in this regard will influence their foreign policy positions if either of them were to win the presidency?
I'd say probably not. I'd be very surprised on matters of foreign policy. I think there are distinct differences in terms of some of the core impulses, and you're going to get some differences there. Quid pro quos based upon donations from foreign operators, or foreign interests, having that influence your decision as a president of the United States, would just be malfeasance. I mean, that just would be horrible. And I don't think, I wouldn't expect that from the Clinton administration, and certainly not Sanders. The broader disposition of these two candidates towards moneyed interests, though, is salient. I think Clinton tends to be more incremental and adopts more of a collaborative posture, and Sanders is more confrontational in terms of taking moneyed interest on. But I don't really think donations to the Clinton Foundation are going to affect Hillary Clinton's foreign policy decisions.
As a follow-up to that, the arms sales to these countries increased 143% under Clinton's administration as Secretary of State. So is there, and some of these countries that gave donations to the Clinton Foundation have made human rights violations. Do you think there's no a relationship between the donations to the Clinton Foundation and the selling of arms to despotic regimes that may violate human rights? Should we be concerned about that relationship?
Well, I think there's certainly concerns about the sales, the arms sales, and the violence, what happens after those sales. These are certainly valid concerns. The counterfactual, that had donations not been made to the Clinton Foundation, would there be no arms sales? The arms sales were quid pro quo, in reaction to the donations. I have a hard time believing that.
That would be a pretty serious ethical violation.
That's disqualifier right there.
So let's stick with the money for a minute.
But as a general, and this is more of a, I think, and I think Sanders folks, there is a point, and there's something that I think sometimes it's labeled as corruption, but I think it's more of a systemic problem. In that. Those, and you see it a lot in domestic policy as well. It's how campaigns are financed. I think what you have a question later on. I think how Sanders is doing it is wonderful. But quid pro quo, as opposed to being access with respect to certain interests, whether they be domestic or foreign interests. To a higher office, whether or not you're hearing out concerns, these subtle things, I think, are problematic, and I don't want to dismiss those valid concerns, but the fact that you're going to double somebody's arms sales because they donated to the Clinton Foundation, that's a serious charge.
As a follow-up, what incentive do these governments have for donating to the Clinton Foundation, do you think, other than having their special interests be served? Why do they care about the Clinton Foundation? Why are they donating money to it?
I think that probably for the same reasons that people donate to local campaigns. If they, if the policies take into consideration the interests of the countries, they don't want to be seen as being the country that doesn't make a donation to the Clinton Foundation. So there are systemic concerns, but nevertheless, I just don't see somebody sitting in an office at the Clinton Foundation and let's double the sales because we just got the check in from the Saudis.
So on a related issue, many people feel that U.S. policies towards Israel are unduly influenced by AIPAC and by wealthy pro-Israel donors. It appears from many of her statements that Hillary Clinton is beholden to these same interests. In contrast, Bernie Sanders is financing his campaign largely with small donations, giving him independence from large pro-Israel campaign donors. On the other hand, Bernie is Jewish, spent time on a kibbutz, and is from a family of Holocaust survivors. How do you think these differences would affect their policies towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
On this conflict, this is such an intractable problem that if either candidate, if they were to become president, felt as if they had a window of opportunity to at least make progress in slowing down the cycle of violence, let alone come up with a permanent solution, I think that they would go after it. I don't think that Bernie's personal history or AIPAC donations are going to affect the positions of the candidates on this issue. I think there are some differences, very subtle differences. I think Sanders has probably been a bit more critical historically of the Israeli government. But I mean, each candidate's position on the Iranian deal, and we're seeing stuff happen within the last few days on that. Events as they unfold, they'll react in real time, and I'm not sure concerns about AIPAC dollars are going to affect that. And I think you've already seen Bernie Sanders. Again, his history, his family's experience with the Holocaust, his own personal time in Israel still does not, lead him to a place where he is defiantly pro-Israel on everything that the government does.
That's true.
I think the point to make here is that's a really tough situation there, and I think whatever they think that they can do if they're elected to try to help that situation is probably going to matter more than some historical roots or some donations from a campaign.
Thank you.
So, moving on to a different issue, studies now report that climate change was a major contributor to political unrest in the Middle East. In the years leading up to the civil war in Syria, 60% of Syria's fertile land turned into desert. And in 2010, the year before the war began, 80% of the country's cattle was killed in drought. The CIA recently recognized climate change as a significant national security threat. Which candidate do you think is most likely to acknowledge and address the threat that climate change poses as a part of their foreign policy?
Well, both candidates, I think, will take climate change seriously and acknowledge it. The problem here is not acknowledging. It's very hard to lead internationally on the issue of climate change if you cannot move the dial in your own country. And we've seen that with the Obama administration. So with a hostile Congress, you've seen the Obama administration pivot late in its second term to do everything that it can through its own executive authority. And now most recently the Supreme Court, prior to Antonin Scalia's death, rejected or at least put a stay on the signature piece of legislation, the Clean Power Plan, which will hold up again. That will slow down anything the United States can do. So I think it's not a matter of one candidate caring more about climate change than the other. I think Clinton and Bernie Sanders both take it very, very seriously. Who is going to be able to unlock or move the dial? Who's going to be able to kind of crack their forces of resistance domestically? That'll, again, free them up some space that they can take more of a leadership role. And that's a big question about, again, how to overcome recalcitrant domestic interests.
Do you have any opinion about who might be more effective at actually moving the political scene here?
Yeah, I think Sanders is a bit untested. I think for Clinton, you have a number of years' experience. You have a lot of battle wounds, and you have her ending up at a place after 20 years where she focuses more on triangulation, incremental change, and she'll often collaborate and compromise with the dark side forces, and she takes some raps for that, but the ball gets moved, and over time you think you get better and better at being able to do that. So I would have some confidence that she'd be able to get some things done. I think Sanders he has been consistent. He's a person of conviction, and I think that his sincerity of his views are above reproach. What he would do, though, what he knows that we haven't been able to see before, what's his secret for unlocking? I think if you look at the Obama administration, they tried to overcome or transcend some of the forces of resistance, had a really hard time. So with Sanders, I don't know. Maybe he knows something that I don't know. Otherwise, once in office, he'll come back and look like Clinton.
So one of the most memorable pushback moments in the debate was when Senator Sanders pointed out Clinton's relationship with former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who was a friend and a mentor for her in some ways. Sanders stated, "I find it rather amazing because I happen to believe that Henry Kissinger was one of the most destructive Secretaries of State in the modern history of this country. I am proud to say that Henry Kissinger is not my friend." What are your thoughts on the candidates' differing views on Kissinger?
Well, I think Sanders likely scored some points. So in a primary election, I don't think Clinton's relationship with Kissinger is going to get her many votes. So I think Sanders scored some points on that one. Will it hurt Clinton in a general election? I don't think so.
And I want to ask just a final question. Right right now, many Americans, progressives, are pretty concerned that over 50% of the discretionary funding used by the federal government goes to the military. A lot of people are also hoping that for anybody who takes office, war will be a last resort. For those who believe that less federal funding should be spent on war and war should be a last resort, which candidate do you think will represent those people?
So are you asking just reduction in defense budget dollars? Or?
Well, specifically, I think I'm asking if we're looking for the prevention of war and using diplomacy as the first option, and then, of course, that will yield less money being spent on our defense budget. Which candidate do you think will be the best at reducing our defense budget and also using diplomacy, keeping war as the last resort?
I think an accurate, this is a lot of hypotheticals, but an accurate characterization is in many areas of the world, the impulse on the part of Clinton will be cautious engagement early on. And so I think you're going to probably get involved from a military perspective in more places with a Clinton earlier on, with a Clinton presidency than with a Sanders presidency. There's risk there, which is, failure to deal with something can lead you to a situation where, you have somebody, that comes in 4 years after Sanders and then takes the level of military intervention and militarization at a place that's, well beyond where you are, with Clinton dealing with something a little bit more early. There's a lot of hypotheticals associated with that, but I think the short answer is if you are strongly anti-militarism, I think Sanders probably is closer to where you are on the issues. There's a risk, though, is that if you're interested in long-term less militarism, then it becomes a little bit more difficult on what's the most effective strategy.
And I just want to challenge you on that. Would you disagree that the early intervention, in many examples, including Iraq, has led to long-term less militarism or more militarism?
I think the track record, certainly in Iraq, it's led to more militarism. So I don't want to attempt to be a champion of intervention, because I think historically the case is pretty solid that our imperialistic impulses have created more trouble than they've solved. However, I still have a problem sometimes. It's whether you like it or not, it's almost like a multi-level Game of Thrones. Just because the United States doesn't get involved in a particular situation doesn't mean that there's going to be a lot of intervention on a lot of other parties. And, staying out of things doesn't always lead to happy endings.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you being here. For people who want to learn more about foreign issues, where would you direct them to for more information?
One of my favorite websites is the Council of Foreign Relations, www.cfr.org. It's a pretty big place, and they have lots of smaller backgrounds to longer op-eds on a variety of different foreign policy hotspots and issues, and they include a diversity of opinions, and so it's a pretty good place to bone up, without having a particular view jammed down your throat.
Thank you. We've been talking with Professor Alcock, Professor of Political Science at New College. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Alcock. It's been very, very interesting.
Thanks for having me on.
If you want to learn more about this show, give us feedback, or share ideas for topics or speakers, you can find us on Facebook. Just search Let's Talk About the Middle East. If you leave an interesting comment, we'll give you a shout out on the next show. You can find this interview and others on our podcast site. Don't forget to join us next Sunday, March 20th at Fogartyville Media and Arts Cafe for the second in the series on Israel and Palestine called Finding a Path to Peace. This event will explore the experience of being the other and will be led by Professor Zabriskie from New College.